Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout with Lincoln Square, and it is Sunday, and that means it is time for Unholy Ground with me and Andra Watkins. Andra, how are you?
Welcome to church, everyone.
I wore my Sunday school shirt, as we would call it, any button-up when I was a kid. Yeah. How was your week?
It's been good. We've been without an elevator for 2 days, and they just fixed it today. So it'll be nice to not have to do 9 flights of stairs anymore to get a bottle of water or some toilet paper.
Yeah, having lived in New York for so long, and I always lived in. Actually, I didn't always live in an elevated building, but I had friends who were 8, 9 floors up, no elevator, just crazy.
You're in good shape.
I mean, also we were all 29 years old, and so
yeah,
we can do whatever we want. Well, everyone, welcome. This is one of my favorite half hours of the week, and this week, Andra, you've been writing about the counterterrorism strategy, and so I just want to set the table a little bit. We're going to talk about this. It's got all the amazing villains behind it, Seb Gorka and the white Christian nationalists and all of this kind of stuff. But it is a document that is legally that they are legally bound to produce. And last week, the White House released it. It's the counterterrorism strategy, as I said. And so much of the commentary on this document released last week is that it was sloppy and leaves us all less safe, and all of the things that you can expect from a brilliant mind like Seb Gorka. But you noticed something different about this document, and particularly Tom Nichols wrote in The Atlantic that this was unfocused. It was run by amateurs, which is all true, and we're going to get to that point. But you have a different take. Can you just set up this document? What is the document? What's it meant to do? And where are we with this thing?
Historically, the U.S. counterterrorism strategy was a document that each administration is required to produce that talked about how the United States saw threats and how it was preparing and protecting the American people from those threats. It was predominantly external, but it would also look at internal domestic terror threats as well. But predominantly external. How do we protect Americans from foreign threats on American soil, or when Americans are outside of the country? How do we keep Americans safe? How do we keep Americans' bodies safe and their data safe? That's what it has historically been designed to do. And as you said, administrations are required to produce one. It's a document that has long-standing precedent.
Right. It's intended for an audience of not only intelligence and security, services and personnel, but also for our government, for the other governments around the world, and for us, right? But it is, at its core, it's a strategy, which means, like you have the threat, and then you have concrete ways, means of defending against those particular threats. And this one was, like in the Nichols piece, and I think, you've provided a give link in your Substack to the Nichols piece. And I think everyone should read it, because it is, Tom Nichols is an amazing writer, and he comes with a package of expertise and experience that is pretty remarkable. And he's looking at this document through that lens. And like, to be fair, Gorka is, we're years into this fucking administration, and now we're only getting this document currently at this moment. And it was after prodding from journalists and some level of embarrassment on Gorka's part. And it does feel thrown together, right? But there are some some things that we ought to be worried about in this thing. Nichols sort of talks about typos. He talks about the document's obsession with Biden as total proof that it's not serious. Like all of this stuff we're facing is everyone else's fault. It says stuff like, in order to defend against terrorism, we need to fight terrorism, which is just not a strategy,
And for people like Tom Nichols, who has a wealth of experience, is incredibly intelligent.
Yes.
A document like this is a joke. It's an insult. How could the regime have somebody who's so inept? And so he writes from that perspective. And I've seen other people who have worked in government say the same thing about it. This is just so insulting, really.
Yeah.
To what this has always been about. So when you come at it from that perspective of how insulting to everything I contributed when I was in government and everything everyone around me contributed when they were in government, how insulting to put something like this out. So most of the people that I've seen writing about it have written about it from that lens. And unfortunately, it doesn't help the American people understand what this really is.
Exactly. And Nichols' point is that this document shouldn't necessarily be taken seriously, except that as a security document or counterterrorism document, it actually does leave us less safe. But you say that it leaves us less safe in an entirely different way. And you are the Rosetta Stone of white Christian nationalist garbled speech. So let's get into that a little bit. Gorka says he identified some threats as anti-American, radically pro-transgender, and anarchist. And he promises to map them at home, identify their membership, map their ties to international organizations like Antifa. I don't know if anyone was surprised to see that. And use law enforcement tools to cripple them operationally before they can maim or kill the innocent. And it also promises to do the same with state sponsors of such groups and those governments. Obviously, nobody knows who those state sponsor groups are or what states those are. But what's actually going on here?
Well, in prior episodes of Unholy Ground, we've talked about Project Esther, which was the Heritage Foundation's document to turn all dissent into terrorism. If you disagree with the regime, you are a de facto domestic terrorist. That's really what that document was about. And a few months later, Pam Bondi's Attorney General's office released a document, or that it was a presidential memorandum called NSPM-7, which we have talked about extensively here, which outlines 10 different vectors of danger of things that this regime will consider to be domestic terror. And it's things that are so subjective, like anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, hostility toward traditional views, American views on the family. It's very, very subjective in terms of what those things actually are. Depending on your education and where you grew up and your belief systems, you're going to define those things very differently. So this document is called our counterterrorism strategy, but it's really an entirely new thing that the regime produced because they have to produce a counterterrorism strategy. So they wrote this entirely new thing that is a continuation of Project Esther and NSPM-7 to quantify how they're going to make the people in NSPM-7 be charged with domestic terror, how they're going to go after dissenters, which is anyone who disagrees with a white Christian nationalist, and call them domestic terrorists. So it's a completely new thing. We've not seen this before. That they slap the name counterterrorism strategy on it is irrelevant. Maybe it was intentional in that it distracts people like Tom Nichols into going, my brain is broken because this is so not a counterterrorism strategy. And I'm trying to reconcile all the other ones that I've read and participated in the past with whatever this is. But it's not supposed to be a counterterrorism strategy. It's something completely new.
And, Gorka even writes that a new type of domestic terrorism has emerged, right? And, a new type of domestic terrorism, you equate that to dissent.
Yes.
Right. And so who is he painting? And go a little bit deeper into that. Who is he painting as our enemy?
Well, for readers who don't know a lot about Sebastian Gorka, and admittedly,
let's dive into that guy because he's a little man.
Admittedly, there are some people that have always revolved around this regime that I just didn't want to know about. They're triggering to look at. And so it was an education for me to dig into him. He's Hungarian, but was born in the UK, has deep, deep ties to Viktor Orban and Christian nationalism in Hungary. He is a raging white Christian nationalist. He was one of the primary authors of the Regime One's Muslim ban. He believes that Islam is a horrible cult, that they all need to be expelled from the earth. He is in the camp with Pete Hegseth and his mentor, Doug Wilson, who believe that worship is warfare, that we are on a crusade to eradicate all enemies of white Christian nationalists from the face of the earth, that using warfare tactics to kill their enemies is appropriate and necessary to achieve the kind of world they want to have. So he's that person who espouses those kinds of beliefs. He's very radicalized as a Christian nationalist. So once you understand that that's the perspective that he has on where we are as a country, where we are as a planet, his writings start to come into more focus. You can set aside, or should set aside, everything a counterterrorism strategy has ever been before and go, well, what is this thing? What is it? And it is a white Christian nationalist document that outlines how they are going to suppress anyone who disagrees with them. That's what it is.
And I think that is an interesting point because, Tom Nichols comes with a context, right? And it's very smart and very sharp and very based on his particular expertise. But you have a particular expertise that is more aligned with the expertise of Seb Gorka, right?
Right.
And so reading that document from a counterterrorism context is you're getting lost in translation. Mm-hmm. This is fundamentally a white Christian nationalist document. And as we go into this summer of celebrating the 250, right, and going forward into the next 250, these documents become a roadmap for white Christian nationalist control over all of us. And I one thing that you talked about in your writing this week, this week, we're airing on Sunday. It's still this week. The documents, this document, here's the counterterrorism strategy document. It's like 16 short pages. As you can see,
a lot of repetition, a lot of themes repeat.
I mean, it is pretty sloppy if we're being honest, but that may be the point. They say, he says that some of these groups, the ones we mentioned, the Antifas, the radical trans groups, which is so weird to me. They have adopted ideologies that are antithetical to freedom, right? But freedom is another word that gets lost in translation for us normies, right? What does he mean by freedom? This is so interesting to me.
When Christian nationalists use words like freedom and liberty, you and I have a set thing. We know what we think that means. You know, we have the right to live our lives and live and let live and make our own choices and have control of our own minds. You know, that's what most Americans, rugged individualism, even for some Americans, is what freedom and liberty mean. But in Christian nationalism, that's not what those words mean. And they started using this in Project 2025. And then early February of 2024, I pointed out that one of the promises, the 4 promises that they made in that document, was to secure all Americans' rights to enjoy the blessings of liberty. And they define that as Americans are free. We have the liberty not to do what we want, but what we ought. And that exact language is in Project 2025. That is their definition of freedom. And as a former white Christian nationalist who was steeped in that ideology as a child and teenager, that was a Bible verse. I knew it immediately. It's a Bible verse from Romans, written by the Apostle Paul, that says we are here not to do what we want, but what we ought. And so that when you look at freedom through that lens, that means Seb Gorka is saying you have the freedom to do what you ought. And what I say you ought to do is this interpretation of the Bible that I'm going to force on you, because you ought to do this. That's the only thing you have freedom and liberty to do, according to my reading of Scripture. So I am going to force that on you. You don't have the freedom to do what you want. You don't have the freedom to live and let live. You don't have the freedom to be a rugged individual. You don't have the freedom to your own mind. You have the freedom to do what you ought. And here is what you ought to do. You ought to be a white Christian nationalist. That's what he means when he uses the word freedom or liberty.
They even,
and everyone like him mean that.
And in the document, and you outline this so beautifully, everyone, if you're just joining, this is Unholy Ground with me and Andra Watkins from For Such a Time as This. And she's been writing this week about counterterrorism, of all things. But if you're just joining, you'll be surprised to learn that terrorism is conducted by non-Christian nationalists, according to Seb Gorka. They also, in the document, and again, you outline this, talk about the founding fathers and, the pursuit of liberty, the pursuit of freedom. They're like, yes, they did say that, but it should be maybe more aligned with the concept of the pursuit of blessedness, right? And freedom and liberty are not things that you, as you said, want to achieve, but something you ought to, you have a responsibility. Like, that's what the Constitution is about. Not about your freedoms, but about your responsibilities. And liberty and freedom, they further say, is actually not what we think of as liberty and freedom. Liberty and freedom means getting married. Oh, there's my stupid emoji again. I will never turn that off, because it always comes up at the exact wrong time. But I love it. So getting married, being white is liberty and freedom, right? Sort of having dominion over your woman or your women.
Yeah.
That's what liberty and freedom entails for them. And so this document it may be a vague strategy, but it's really a statement of purpose.
Yeah. And, we have to back up a couple of steps from that point, because for a Christian nationalist, true liberty, true freedom is not of this earth. It's not a state you live in with your neighbors, in your communities, in your cities and towns, and in your countries. True freedom to a Christian nationalist like Seb Gorka is spiritual freedom. It is rejecting the nature that you were born with, to not to do what you want, not what you ought. And you reject that nature, you lay it aside for the greater nature, the greater spiritual choice of doing what you ought, which is following white Christian nationalist Bible, living the white Christian nationalist life. So once you understand that that's really what he's talking about, rejecting that old nature and taking on this new nature that, and when I would sit in a Christian nationalist pew as a child, salvation, which is a relatively recent concept, the concept of getting saved came out of 1830s revivals in the pre-Victorian era. So, the concept of getting saved is not in the Bible. It's relatively new, but it was always preached to me as the ultimate freedom. You're throwing off your old nature and you're putting on the armor of God. You're accepting. And armor of God was used a lot. There's that warfare imagery again that I got, as a child. So that is really what they're talking about when they're talking about freedom and liberty. And it's really, really important to understand that is we are going to force everyone to kneel. We're going to force everyone to do what they ought. And anyone who refuses to do what they ought will be a terrorist. That's really what they're saying. That's really what this is about.
And so I think it's also worth mentioning, like, look, another reason why counterterrorism experts missing the point of this is so important is because, yeah, for sure, feels like a culture war document, right? It feels like, it's like, in some ways it feels like Trump rambling behind a podium somewhere in a big arena, right? But they are, NSPM 7 has created an FBI joint mission center to target groups with anti-Christian or anti-American views. And anti-Christian and anti-American they view as the same thing, right? They state in this own document that Christians are the most persecuted people on the planet, which is the dumbest thing. It just does not stand up to any scrutiny at all.
Okay. Again, that's another thing that we can really dig into and help everyone understand why they react the way you just did. Because to a Christian nationalist like Seb Gorka, when he talks about his faith and you go, I don't want to hear that. That's violence to him.
Right.
That's dissent. That is a commission of violence against him. When you roll your eyes and go, I don't want, that's violence to him. When you say, I believe something else and I don't believe that, that's violence to him. Any kind of dissent, any kind of disagreement with a white Christian nationalist is interpreted as violence. It's persecution because you're not allowed in those communities to disagree with the leaders. So, they're expanding that out, and that's how they train people in those groups to see persecution everywhere. Anyone who disagrees with you is persecuting you. Anyone who asks a question that offends you is persecuting you. Anyone who challenges you is committing violence against you. That is what they're taught. So when you understand that that's how they're indoctrinated, to see him say, we're the most persecuted people ever. You can disagree with it, but it can suddenly make sense that that's how they see the world that way.
Yeah, I have no doubt that he actually believes that. I mean, it's bullshit, obviously. But I think, one of the bigger points here is that it's not just statements they're making. They are actually putting, coercion and forces and policy in place to make it so. Right. I mean, they're still, investigating, the IRS is investigating nonprofits that don't conform. Right. Where's the freedom in that? Well, in their mind, freedom doesn't mean what you and I think it means. So for them, yeah, this is actually a action in support of freedom. And so is, taking away birth control from women. So is removing hormones from the access of women, not men, but women. Right. So is ending no-fault divorce. All of these things are in service to their idea of freedom. And that should scare the hell out of everyone in this audience. They're coming for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And until more Americans understand that I'm not just a hysterical harpy who's exaggerating how they see the world, this is how they see the world. Whether you know anybody or not who sees the world that way, whether you've ever experienced this yourself, doesn't make it not a fact that this is how they see the world. And they intend to make you eventually kneel to this. Eventually they will get to you. Even white men who refuse to conform. And that's why I keep going back to Heather Cox Richardson's discussions several months ago of the Taliban and how Afghan men sat and watched women be imprisoned in their homes and didn't do anything. And now the Taliban's coming for the men and saying your beards have to look this way and your clothes have to look this way and you have to be at mosque every time the doors are open. And if you miss too many times, we're going to put you in jail. And the men are like, I don't understand. I didn't think they'd do this to men. And so I want everybody here to understand that white Christian nationalists are hardwired the same way to force conformity on everyone in society. They're using immigrant communities now to test all the different levers they have to apply those tools to the rest of us. And they're learning from that. And, but eventually that will apply to other people. People have asked me this week, why can't we just sue over these violations of the First Amendment? Well, because we have to have some specific harm and violation to do that. We can't just say the regime is eventually going to come for people who are disagreeing with them. And so we're suing. That's not how our rule of law works. And that's also part of what they've planned for. Rather than wait for people to sue and claim that they have rights, they're just going to target dissenters the same way they're targeting immigrants now. And disappear them and send somebody into their homes. And, that can be scary and that can sound hysterical and that can sound dark, but it's also something that we have to think about and face. What are we going to do if that happens? How are we going to prepare ourselves? How are we going to prepare our communities? How are we going to push back?
I think there's another, element here in, like, look, we saw Trump sue himself, right? So their definition of, of damages and of who is victim and who is perpetrator is inverted, right? So all of this is getting to that bigger point that you can sue, except that by dissenting against them, they're the victims, right? They are the ones
Just
who
more Darvo, which we talked about this week.
Darvo, oh my God, exactly. I mean, that's exactly what it is. So you wrote that, keeping your head down won't save anyone. This regime's wrath, and you said this just a minute ago, will visit all who refuse to kneel.
Mm-hmm.
So what the hell do we do? And why isn't silence the safe option here? I mean, because look, for everyone out here, it's like, maybe I just keep my head down and just go about my business and they won't bother me.
They're still not to a point where they can arrest 100 million people. They may get to that point, but they're not there yet. The more of us who are speaking out and the more of us who are opting out, the harder it becomes for them to do this on a mass scale. Fascists have to have compliance to be successful. And if enough people can opt out because they've built parallel structures, they have community support networks, they have ways of getting the things that they need without that system, then they are powerful. And we have so much time to be doing that right now. We should be speaking out, absolutely, because the more of us that speak out, the harder it makes it for the regime to continue down this path. It's sand in the gears. Our voices, every voice is another grain of sand in the gears. So we have to look at it that way. But we also have to look at the time we have. If they continue to grind toward what they want, to say, how do we just go, I'm not doing any of this, and I'm going to go over here and live my life with my community, and this is how we're going to get what we need, and this is how we're not going to need anything they're selling us, and we're going to exist over here. The regime with their Darvo is going to probably try to define groups like that, like the Branch Davidian cult, sure, and stuff like that. But at the same time, that is how Americans have to prepare for the possibility that you'll need those systems. You have to set them up before you need them, and continue to throw their voices as grains of sand in the gears to slow this regime down. Peter Thiel and Alex Karp were have been freaking out because this hasn't gone as smoothly as they wanted it to. Americans are resisting, and they aren't where they wanted to be by now. And so, especially in the recent couple of months, their actions are increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. And so we can capitalize on that too by getting even louder and resisting even more. That's part of what dismantles these kinds of systems. It can feel counterintuitive, but it shouldn't. The more they tell you they want you to shut up, the more you should speak up. You have to do Darvo with them and just do the opposite of what they want you to do. Because if you do what they want you to do, we're all going to suffer a lot more than we will if we don't listen to them in the long term.
I think that's a great way to kind of wrap here. Everyone, if you are not a subscriber to For Such a Time as This on Substack, you really ought to be. It's like this is like a supplement to that. As I always see it, it's like I'm like the dumb, like non-speaker, the non-fluent. You're teaching me a new language every week. I feel like I'm getting there. Like I'm getting a little more fluent in it.
And as I said in my post today, it's hard to learn a new language when you're an adult. My husband and I are doing it right now. And, it's not easy. So none of this is easy, but it's necessary.
It's necessary. And I think especially when you come up in either as a mainstream Christian or not Christian at all, or not, totally secular, this just seems so absurd. It is anti-rational. It sort of grasps at the weirdest straws. It feels so deeply personal in a way that is upsetting to me. Like, why does Seb Gorka give a shit about my family? You know, like it doesn't make, why is the way I live my life such an affront to him? I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. And so that's where Andra Watkins comes in and is like, you got to pay attention to this, dummy. Well, in any case,
I never called you a dummy.
I call myself a dummy. Well, and I have plenty of people around me to call me a dummy every day. But everyone, thank you for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe to Lincoln Square. Subscribe to For Such a Time as This. And we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.